Israel risks losing the information war in its latest bombardment on Gaza. And if it does, it will have a lot to do with Palestinians pushing back against biased mainstream media narratives. Yara Eid is a Palestinian journalist and human rights advocate who appeared on Sky News this weekend.
It has been 2 weeks since Hamas first launched its attack on Israel. It saw 1,400 people killed. Since then, Palestinian officials say that more than 4,000 people have died in Gaza. Reporting on the war has been personal for Palestinian journalist and human rights advocate Yara Eid, who joins me now. Yara, thank you for joining us here on Sky News. I understand that recent events have caused you personally a great deal of grief and pain.
Well, I lost more than 30 members of my immediate family, and they were civilians. They were not part of any militant group. Most of them were children. 17 of them are children. Not only that, but my best friend was a journalist, and Israel killed him in cold blood on the 7th of October while he was covering the area's border. And he was wearing a press vest. He was wearing his helmet. And I just want to say, before I continue talking about what's happening, when you first introduced what's happening, you said more than 1,400 people have been killed in Israel and more than 4,000 in Palestine have died. I think language is really important to use, because language, as a journalist, you have the moral responsibility to report on what's happening. Palestinians don't just die, they get killed. They are actually being subjected to ethnic cleansing, to genocide for the last 75 years.
I mean, that's so powerful and so well put. And I suppose I really think what's shifting the dial here, on the one hand, it does seem like the bombardment of Gaza is like nothing we've seen before. You know, people on the ground are saying this is not like what we've seen before. This is way more intense. This is way more deadly. Way more people are dying, right? At the same time, it does seem like there are more people speaking to the mainstream media who know people who have, you know, been experiencing the horrific reality on the ground in Gaza. And that makes it harder to just see these as, oh, they're these faceless, nameless people in the distance, which is how often people from countries who aren't allied to the UK are seen. You know, nameless, faceless, they don't really matter. The people who matter are our allies and their citizens, and everyone else is basically anonymous. The fact that there are Palestinians going on television and saying, actually, you know, this isn't abstract. My friends, my family, they are dying in this. They're being killed in these attacks, in this bombardment. And then that leads obviously to the second point, which she made so articulately there, which was that in Sky's intro, they said that Israelis were killed and Palestinians died. So using the active voice for when Israelis die and using the passive voice for when Palestinians die, right? Obviously, the Israelis were killed in those attacks and the Palestinians were killed in Israel's bombardment. Let's go back to the interview.
You also mentioned that this is a Hamas-Israel war. This is not it. And framing it as such is very misleading, because it poses the thing that Israel is an equal power, but it's an occupying power. And it actually has the responsibility of protecting all civilian lives and children in Gaza. But what we've been seeing is more than 1,700 of those who are killed are children.
So two really important points there. Saying this is the Israel-Hamas war is suggesting that, yeah, this is a war between a country and a militant group, right? But it's clearly not. This is a war between the Israeli government and the Israeli army and a territory of 2.2 million people, right? They are carpet bombing. This is not a targeted attack on Hamas. We have seen over 5,000 people dying, according to Gazan officials, and according to the UN, we're seeing 40% of all homes being damaged or destroyed in Gaza. To what extent, when you've got an occupying force bombing a people they occupy, you can even call it a war? Because there aren't two independent states which are going up against one another. So it's not what we normally think of as a war. I mean, at the same time, obviously, the Algerians, when they fought back against the French, that was called the Algerian War of Independence. So you can have a war of a people against their occupier, but it's very different, I think, to the sort of most the way that it's normally portrayed in the media, which is you've got these two independent countries. One of them has attacked the other. They're saying this started when Hamas attacked Israel, and now Israel has the right to fight back against this other independent country which attacked them. No, you have one entity which is occupying the other. That's how this started. Let's go to the last question in the interview.
Hamas launched the attack on Israel. As a Palestinian, what did you expect would happen next?
Well, I think, again, I'm sorry, but I think this is misleading, because you can't water down what's been happening about the attack on the 7th of October. Let's talk about 2014. Let's talk about 2021. Let's talk about all the aggressions, Palestinians in Gaza. Me personally, let's not talk about Palestinians in Gaza. I've lived through 4 horrible aggressions. That's actually why I left Gaza in the first place. I saw people getting cut into pieces in front of my eyes when I was 14 years old. I spent the last 7 years trying to get therapy to get over my PTSD, my traumatic experience of just living there. So this is, again, you're misleading by saying it's a Hamas attack. You need to say what's been happening. We can't look at it just by looking at what's happened on the 7th of October. Why are you not talking about all of the other attacks on worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque, on, kidnapping women and raping them in Israeli jails, all these Palestinians who are being killed in the West Bank? Why are you not asking me about them? Hamas does not operate there.
Yara Eid, good to get your perspective on Sky News. Thank you very much for joining us.
Really, really powerful answer. I think it's important to say that, sometimes people say, how dare the host ask that question? Now, the host asked a question because she wanted an answer, right? So the host isn't necessarily, putting forward her view. But I do think that sort of the bias is in, it's not specific to Sky, is it? It's just what is the sort of common sense by which this conflict, this occupation is covered in the Western media. It's completely different to how the Western media covers Ukraine, for example. No one calls it the Ukraine-Russia conflict. They call it the Ukraine war, the invasion of Ukraine, the occupation of Ukraine. It's not the Ukraine-Russia conflict yet. This is the Israel-Palestine conflict, this intractable conflict between these two entities that just can't agree to get along. No, there's one entity which is occupying another entity. It's an occupation. It has a lot more in common with Russia and Ukraine than how are they talking about it? Potentially, I don't know. So I'm not exactly sure what the comparison would be. I suppose maybe they're talking about it a bit more like it's like Pakistan and India when they were sort of in conflict with each other.
I thought the second response about it not being a Hamas-Israel war is a really pertinent one, because what we've seen, even just from October the 7th, is an escalation of aggression in the West Bank. So you have Palestinians in the West Bank being detained, being arrested. There are reports emerging of absolutely appalling treatment being meted out to Palestinians while in Israeli custody. You've got conditions of curfew, of effective lockdown across huge parts of the West Bank, the closing down of checkpoints, and you've even had an Israeli strike on Jenin in the West Bank. Allegedly, Hamas was operating out of the West Bank, but the West Bank is not controlled by Hamas. So this is not merely an Israel-Hamas war. It is a war being waged against the people of Palestine, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. And I think when you look at what's going on with the arrests of Arab Israelis being accused of supporting Hamas, simply for showing solidarity with the people of Gaza, I think you've also got a good case to make about this impacting, being waged, through the criminal justice system on Palestinians in Israel as well. And just to sort of respond to something you said about the host, I agree that hosts put questions to guests in order to elicit a response from them. And it doesn't mean that the host believes in the question that they're asking. But the line of questioning that was taken by that host with Yara Eid was totally devoid of any historical context. So once again, it's beginning the conversation of Israel and Palestine on October 7th rather than the illegal occupation, rather than the bombardments of Gaza that we've seen periodically, 2021, 2014, Operation Cast Lead before that. And so it's a narrative which betrays a pro-Israel bias because you're unable to talk about the wider context, which you could argue led to October the 7th. And the second thing is that I agree that something which is really different about how this period of violence is being covered is different, in that you're seeing many more Palestinian voices on British media than you would have decades ago. But I feel quite uncomfortable when a Palestinian woman is having to say, multiple members of my family have just been killed. I have PTSD from being a child and seeing people cut to pieces in front of me. It reminds me of what Mohammed Al-Kurd said about having to be the perfect victim and having to constantly show your bruises. And I think that when you have a line of questioning which is devoid of historical context, and it forces Palestinians into having to sort of show their bruises, demonstrate how they're the perfect victim, it does then keep the discussion, I think, in this really limited place in a way which ultimately benefits the state of Israel, because Israel gets to define what the context is. And at best, Palestinians get to say, oh, well, I suffer too. That's still a media framing which doesn't recognize the Palestinian cause in the same way that it advocates Israeli narratives.